Hello everyone and welcome to Minty's Top EDH Sleepers Underplayed Commander Cards Part 1. This is a new series I'm starting where I talk about some of my favorite underplayed or undervalued Magic cards for Commander. And some of these are budget, some of them are not. They're just cards I don't see very often in my play group or in any play group, honestly. Before I start, I do want to give a shout out to my most recent sub, Matthew Ludovico. If you want me to shout you out, you need to make sure your YouTube account is set to public. Otherwise, I can't see your name and then I can't give you a proper shout out. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into my top underrated cards for Commander. First off is a card that I am very surprised does not see very much play with Gift of Estates. Gift of Estates is a 2-mana card. It's 1 generic and a white for sorcery that says, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for up to 3 plains cards, reveal them and put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. I don't know how this card isn't played in more decks. I mean, I think about green where you're playing Rampant Growth, which is, 1 mana, 1 generic mana, and 1 green mana to get a land into play tapped. This is the same, essentially the same amount of mana to get 3 plains in your hand. And I think the text on the card where it says you can search for plains is what makes this card so much better. You can go search for a Hallowed Fountain. You can go search for a Sacred Foundry. Obviously they get put in your hand, but now you've got land drops for the next 3 turns. I definitely think any mono white deck should run this. Even decks like Zedru where it's red, white, and blue where you don't really have access to other mana sources, it should be an auto-include in those decks. This card is currently only 67 cents and only sees play in 1% of decks on EDH Rec. That's barely 5,000 decks out of 350,000 decks. I don't know why that is. It seems insane to me. Next card on my list is a card called Recall. It is XX Blue. Currently only seen play in 981 decks out of almost 400,000 decks. That's 0% on EDH Rec. Currently only 26 cents as well. Going to read the Oracle text since it has changed a little bit. Discard X cards, then return a card from your graveyard to your hand for each card discarded this way, and then exile Recall. So this card is just amazing. I mean, it can be a 3-mana return a card from your graveyard to your hand. There's a lot of that in green, but there's not really a whole lot of that in blue. And if you want to get real crazy and put 5 mana into it, you're returning 2 cards from your graveyard to your hand. I just think if you're playing mono blue, there's not really a whole lot of ways to get cards back from your graveyard into your hand. Unless you're playing Dimir where you've got some sort of graveyard retrieval because you're playing black. There's just not a whole lot of ways in mono blue to get cards from your graveyard back into your hand. And I think that that's pretty important. I think this card goes really well with an underrated commander of mine as well called Attempts All Seen. Basically, the way you win is by dealing damage to an opponent and then revealing your hands. And if you have 6 different converted mana costs in your hand, that player loses the game. So in instances where you may not have 6 different mana values in your hand, but you have 1 or 2 in your graveyard and your mana flooded, you may be able to discard, 2 lands to get those 2 mana value cards back that you need. And now you've got the 6 cards you need in order to win with the Attempts Triggered ability. Just seems good to me to have a little bit of blue recursion in your deck, and there's not really any other cards that do that. Next up on my list is a black card, Rystic Tutor, and yes, it is from Prophecy. It is from the same set of cards as Rystic Study. Now, not nearly as good, but in my opinion, still underrated. Currently, it sees play in less than 600 decks out of nearly 400,000. 0% on EDH Rec, goes for about $250 right now. 2 generic and a black. Unless a player pays 2, search your library for a card. Put that card into your hand, then shuffle your library. Now you might be thinking, okay, obviously someone's going to pay 2 to counter this. Why would they ever want you to tutor? But this can be kind of a political use. If somebody has an answer and you know exactly what you can get to answer that threat at the board, you can let people know, hey, this person's tapped out. Can you let me tutor for this card? I can save us here. And the other thing, too, is early game, where everyone is ramping, they're playing their rampant growths or Kodama's reaches, all that stuff. There is a good chance that there's a time where everyone at the table is tapped out, and this just becomes a, demonic tutor or whatever for 3. So there are definitely a lot of good tutors out there. I think a lot of them are way overpriced. So, $250 for a card that lets you get any card in your deck is not too bad. Next up is Kyron Negotiations. Yes, a red enchantment. What? It is 2 generic, a red and a red. Tap an untapped creature you control. Kyron Negotiation deals 1 damage to target player. I think this card is amazing in any type of creature-heavy red deck. You know, you got those Krenko Goblin decks. Goblins out, you can literally tap all of those to deal direct damage to a player or planeswalker. And I think that's pretty awesome, especially in decks where people pillow fort. You know, they've got the ghostly prisons and things that prevent you from attacking. Now you've got a way to just directly deal damage to those people. I think that something like this is phenomenal in like a Tourbrand deck. You know, whenever a red source deals damage, it does 2 more damage because of Tourbrand. So you're basically tapping your creatures to ping a player for 3, and I just think that that's a very good, very powerful ability, and I think there's an easy way to kind of break that, especially in those Krenko decks and whatnot. Currently, it is in 0% of decks on EDH Rec out of 375,000. It's about 360, so not the cheapest card on the list, but definitely a solid one in my opinion. Next up on the list is a green card that does see play in 4% of decks, about just under 16,000 decks out of 378,000 decks, and that is Vivian, Champion of the Wild. So this one sees a little bit more play than some of the previous cards mentioned, but I have no idea how this card isn't in every single creature deck. It's a 3-mana planeswalker that just gives your creatures flash. That in and of itself is amazing. The +1 on Vivian says until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gains vigilance and reach. And that's not that bad, but I think where this card really shines outside of the static flash ability is with its -2. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, exile 1 face down, put the rest at the bottom of your library in any order. For as long as it remains exiled, you may look at that card and you may cast it if it's a creature card. So this is basically, you know, look at the top 3 cards of your library, whatever creature you find there, you can just cast at any point of the game, even if Vivian leaves the battlefield. And while she's out there, you can cast that spell as if it had flash, which I think is amazing. I think my favorite use for this card currently is in Arcades the Strategist decks. Honestly, it's just a powerhouse in those decks. I mean, being able to hold up answers until the end of your opponent's turns and then just flash out all of your creatures, draw a bunch of cards with Arcades, and then you've got a full hand of cards at the beginning of your turn is just so powerful. Even though it sees play in 4% of decks, I just don't ever see it at the table, and I have no idea why. This card, in my opinion, is very, very strong. The ability to give all your creatures flash is just too good to pass up. Next up on my list is a colorless card. This is Tourmods Crypt. Tourmods Crypt is a 0-mana artifact that says sacrifice Tourmods Crypt, exile all cards from target player's graveyard. Yes, we know a lot of people like to run things like Bojuka Bog, you know, to exile people's graveyards, especially against those Reanimator decks and the Muldrotha decks and things like that. What I think makes this card almost better than Bojuka Bog is how easy it is to get this card back. You know, there's plenty of ways to get artifacts back into your hand, you know, the Mirror Retrievers and things like that, Junk Divers. Bojuka Bog comes out, and that's it. It's done. Also, it's black, so unless you're running black, you can't even have that card in your deck. Tourmods Crypt can go in any deck. I know I've played this card in a Brea deck, and I was able to crack it, bring it back, crack it, bring it back, and exile 3 different graveyards in one turn. So, pretty nasty card. Currently only in 2% of decks, and it's 34 cents, so I don't see why you wouldn't pick it up. Next up on the list is a multicolored card. This is Rook Thar the Unbowed. Now, this card does see play in about 4% of decks, which seems actually pretty high to me considering I never ever see it in games. Rook Thar is a 6-mana creature. It's 4 generic, a red and a green. For a legendary creature with vigilance and reach, Rook Thar the Unbow attacks each combat if able. Now that alone is honestly pretty good. Vigilance, reach, 6/6, not too bad. But the last ability here is where it shines. Whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, Rook Thar deals 6 damage to that player. 6 damage is not something to scoff about. That is a lot of damage coming at you for casting anything. You know, you cast that Soul Ring, 6 damage. You cast Rystic Study, 6 damage. pretty nuts if you're going up against any type of spell slinger deck. They got to get rid of this as soon as possible, or else they're taking 12, 18, 24 damage, you know. I like the fact that people have to waste their removal to get rid of this card simply because of how oppressive it can be. It's almost like Gruul stacks if you think about it, because people don't want to play into it or they're going to be taking 6. And I've seen people do that. I've seen people take 6, 12, 18 damage by casting 3 spells in one turn, and then it's like, oh, I'm at 10 health. Okay, and then you just swing out at them with Rook Thar and take them out. The last group of cards I want to talk about today are a cycle of lands called Lair Lands from Planeshift. Each of these cards is anywhere from 75 cents to $2. None of them see play in more than 1% of decks on EDH Rec. I'm just not quite sure why. You've got Treva's Ruins, Dromar's Cavern, Croesus Catacombs, Darigaz's Caldera, and Rith's Grove. How these lands work is when they come into play, you have to sacrifice it unless you return a non-lair land you control to its owner's hand. However, they tap for 3 different colors. So Treva's Lair taps for green, white, and blue, and the other lands tap obviously for white, blue, black, and so on and so forth. I'll put them up on the screen so you can see them. Why I think these are underrated is that they don't come into play tapped. You know, these are essentially triomes that don't come into play tapped. Yeah, you have to bounce a land back to your hand, but sometimes that's a good thing. And it doesn't say anything about returning a non-tapped land, so all you have to do is float your land for mana, you know, and then play this land and bounce it back to your hand, and now you've got the mana that you floated plus the mana you can get from the lair land here. And I think the decks where these fit in the best are going to be those Chulane Teller of Tale decks, the Lord Windgrace decks, you know, the Land Matters decks like Obun, Moldiah, Ancestor, things where you get stuff for landfall triggers or you get stuff for putting lands into play. I see these cards being very good in those decks. You know, if you play this card in a Chulane deck and you bounce that land to your hand, all you have to do is cast a creature spell. Now you've put that land that you bounce back into your hand back onto the battlefield. You know, no harm, no foul. I just think that a lot of people play the triomes because, yes, they are fetchable, you know, they're not super expensive, you know, they're usually under $10 or so, but the fact that they come into play tapped is kind of what gets me. With these lair lands, yeah, you're bouncing a land to your hand, but now you've got access to 3 colors right away. No tapping, no waiting till the next turn. I just don't see these get played ever, and I think that they are too good to not be played. Well, that's going to wrap it up for the very first episode of Underplayed Commander cards here on Minty Magic MTG. Please let me know in the comments any underrated cards that you play and anything that you'd like to see in these videos. I'd be more than happy to shout you out and use your card in a future video. Well, that's all I got, you guys. Stay minty out there.